Chapter 12. Like cats and birds, Hedwig landed on the big man's roof, taking a few moments to gulp down her mouse before resuming her watch. The silent man usually passed this way before making one of his long jumps. It had been obvious to Hedwig that the silent man was her boy's sire the moment she had seen him. After all, their plumage was the same color and pattern, though her boy's was perpetually ruffled. He who hunts the evil Ratman, his girl, the fluffy one, called him by the ignominious name of Crookshanks, had explained to Hedwig that humans often altered the color of their plumage, and so did not appreciate the subtle differences in texture and shade. Plus, humans were woefully unobservant, just bordering on stupid. Considering that her boy's red-feathered nestmate had sheltered the evil Ratman from Crookshanks' righteous ire for most of a year, Hedwig couldn't argue. She and Crookshanks were both smugly pleased that their particular people were quite intelligent, far above the average human. Cleaning her talons, Hedwig wished that the Partneasel were here. She was certain he would help her find her boy. The other humans would be little to no help, but even with their stone nest empty for the summer, they had still managed to lose her boy, after all, so she was on her own. She poised herself for action as the silent man finally glided into view. He moved like a hunting alpha, silent, graceful, with no motion wasted. Gliding from limb to limb, Hedwig put on a burst of speed as the man prepared to jump. She seized hold of his magic with her talons and endured being dragged in the man's wake as he leapt to his destination. If her boy wasn't there, she was going to bite the silent man until he took her to the right place. Snape frowned as he landed at the entrance to his ancestral home. Only blood relatives could apparate so near, but he could have sworn he felt a presence apparate nearby. However, the wards remained quiet, so perhaps he was simply more wearied than he thought. Hermione Granger gasped an oath, as Crookshanks used her stomach as a launching pad to leap onto the windowsill. The cat searched the skies, waiting for Hedwig. Though Hermione firmly refused to anthropomorphize animals, at times it seemed that the two familiars were friends. Crookshanks was always waiting at the window when Hedwig appeared. The fact that he was actually looked for her, rather than sensing when she neared the house, began to make Hermione wonder if something was wrong. He was strangely restless, rather like he'd been during most of their third year. "Hermione, there's a Ron Weasley on the telephone for you." Hermione hurried downstairs. Her parents firmly believed that teenagers should not have their own telephones, televisions, or computers in their rooms. Lifting the earpiece, Hermione said, "Hello, Ron," and quickly pulled the phone away. Bracing herself, "Hermione, can you hear me?" Each word was loud and carefully enunciated, as though she were a deaf person. "Yes, Ron, don't speak so loudly." "Heir broken bar, sorry, can you still hear me?" "Yes, crystal clear." "Mum and Dad wanted me to invite you to the Burrow." "Mum wants to talk to your mum and okay it with her." "Sure, I'll just Hermione was interrupted as Ron handed the phone to his mother. "Oh, Ronald, these tones. I just don't know." "Hermione dear, are you there?" Hermione sighed. "Yes, Mrs. Weasley." "Let me speak to your mum." On the tone. "Of course, Mrs. Weasley." Hermione punched the speakerphone button. "Mum, Mrs. Weasley would Mrs. Granger, can you hear me?" Dr. Granger blinked at the voice that blasted from the telephone. "Mum, it's Dr. Granger." "She's a dendy." "Oh, dear, I hope I haven't offended here a drive." "Granger, excuse me, I am very sorry." "Can Hermione Mum, you don't have to shout," Ron said in a knowing tone, having conveniently forgotten that Hermione had to remind him of this at the beginning of every phone conversation. "Young man, I don't need you to tell me how to use the tone. Drive." "Granger, I would like to invite Hermione over for the weekend. She a lovely girl and we would love to have her." "Heir broken bar, yes, that would be quite nice." "Wonderful. We will be by to collect her at 6 this evening. Is that all right?" "Lovely, yes, thank you," she said weakly, having been beaten into submission by Mrs. Weasley's thunderous voice. "Goodbye now." "I will be putting up the tone." There were several scraping and bumping noises, and Ron's voice saying, "Mum, that's backwards." Before the call finally ended, Hermione set Crookshanks' carrier on the car seat beside her, resisting the urge to open the cage so she could clutch him to her. Contrary to her expectations, Mr. Weasley was driving the car. The only other passenger was an Heir named Kingsley Shacklebolt, looking grim and wary. "Has something happened, Mr. Weasley?" she ventured. You will be informed when we are in a secure location, Miss Granger, the Heir answered. Hermione frowned, fidgeting with the book she had retrieved from her purse. Rather than a pleasant weekend at the Burrow, 2/3 of the Gryffindor trio found themselves confined to the creepy Order headquarters until further notice. They had shooed Ginny from the room the two girls would be sharing, in order to do some serious thinking about what was going on. No one would tell them about Harry, but Ron assured Hermione that something bad had happened. The Weasley parents were worried, and Mr. Black and Professor Lupin were only in Grimmauld Place long enough to sleep and snatch a meal before going back on duty, whatever that meant. After hours of fruitless speculation, the two joined Crookshanks in restlessly scanning the sky, hoping for white wings. More than 2 weeks had passed. Much of that time had been spent cleaning and repairing Grimmauld Place, the Black ancestral home. It turned out, whatever the situation was, it had gone from bad to worse, judging by the adults' increasingly frantic behavior. Their attempt to repair a broken window was interrupted by screaming, "Blood traitors and filth, defilers of my house, you will rue the comedy," enraged shrieking abruptly cut off. Driven by boredom, the two Gryffindors made their way down the narrow staircase to see who had dropped by. Hearing loud blubbering in the kitchen, they stopped to listen. "I ain't seen the poor bird for 2 days. Little Harry missin', and now is Owl." Hagrid's voice broke into wet sobs. "Buck up, old man," Black said, his own voice hoarse and weary. "She's probably just gone to find Harry. Maybe she'll bring back a letter from him," he added, growing excited. "Maybe so. I'm sure she's all right, Hagrid." "Hedwig's an uncommonly smart owl," Lupin said comfortingly. Hermione and Ron stared at each other, wide-eyed. Harry was missing ... and it sounded like his best hope was an owl. Chapter 13, Scrolls and Snakes. Albus sighed wearily, rubbing his eyes with thumb and forefinger as the scroll full of translated legal jargon rolled shut. Young Sirius had been right. There was no legal way to separate an heir from their house head, especially if that house head was a lord. Unlike Muggle society, with its proliferation of meaningless titles and obscure nobility, the nobility of the magical world was nearly unchanging. Great Britain had less than 24 noble families. The newest house had held its lordship for 500 years. Of course, the houses themselves remained opaque to anyone outside of their exclusive clique. No diaries or records had ever made it into the mainstream magical world. A handful of dedicated scholars quietly documented the activities of these houses from the outside, gathering articles, noting Wizengamot votes, mapping family trees, and dissecting circumstantial evidence. Galen Strother, one of Tom Riddle's year mates, in fact, was one of these. It was a strange legacy, passed down haphazardly. His records had frustrating blanks where no descendant had taken up the mantle. Galen had loaned him these records with a strange sort of reverence. "Rather a strange hobby, Mr. Strother," Albus said jovially, not wanting to tip the man off to the importance of his request. "It's not a hobby, Headmaster, it's a calling," he said, his eyes disturbingly intense, almost zealous. "These families move in and out of the shadows of our world, yet they guide and rule in ways that the Minister or the Wizengamot can barely imagine." These records contained a history of decisions made for the good of magical society, though often ruthless in their practicality. There was evidence that Lady Ophelia Black had encouraged the spread of the Black Death in the Muggle world in order to distract the Catholic Church from its campaign of witch-burning. A map revealed that some of the most afflicted areas were located near Hogsmeade, Buxbatons, and several other major hubs of medieval magical society, allowing the magical population to establish heavily warded buffer zones between them and the Muggle population. Hundreds of Muggle-born witches and wizards all over Europe had vanished from plague-devastated towns, only to turn up at Hogwarts, Buxbatons, and Durmstrang in their 11th year for schooling, healthy and happy. Lord Bledine Llewellyn and Lord Damien Slytherin had brutally pushed through the construction of St. Mungo's, still Europe's finest magical hospital. Prophet articles at the time had attacked and derided the expense, though the families in question had together donated half the cost of the hospital. The building had been built with some of the strongest materials in the world, and resided on a potent conjunction of ley lines. Of course, such valuable property was not for sale a broken bar until the families owning said property had either quietly capitulated and sold their property, or suddenly found themselves beset by financial difficulties or even imprisoned. Furthermore, the two lords had bullied and blackmailed the finest healers, herbalists, and potion masters into teaching at their fledgling medical school. The best and brightest youth of the age had responded to incentives to study under these masters, producing a generation of dedicated specialists at the expense of the ministry, the Corps, and dozens of businesses. Yet, just as the hospital was fully staffed and functional, a terrible strain of dragonpox threatened to annihilate magical Britain. Had Street Mungo's not been staffed with gifted healers who had access to the powerful ley lines, half of magical Britain's population might have been lost. Indeed, without Lord Salazar Slytherin's brutal political clout, Hogwarts herself may never have been built. The first school of its kind, it was a veritable fortress, built to shelter both people and knowledge. Wizards and witches had sought shelter from the Muggle Cromwell's regime, witch trials, and the Hitler's bombing of London. Lord Slytherin had secured, or coerced, the services of the finest stonemasons and ward builders in the world to construct his school. Even today, Hogwarts could easily feed and shelter tenfold its current student population. No member of these houses had ever been minister. Of course he broke in bar, but plenty of ministers had been toppled from power, or died under strange circumstances, after crossing them. While Lord Voldemort was a figure of fear and loathing, the newly inducted Lord Slytherin bore no such stigma. Dumbledore would be hard-pressed to keep him from acquiring a seat on the Wizengamot, much less deprive him of his heir. Indeed, he was also entitled to a seat on the Board of Governors for both St. Mungo's and Hogwarts herself. Severus dribbled hot wax around the mouth of the corked vial, sealing the last of the potion. It was well after midnight. As he was shelving the books he'd consulted, he heard a whisper of movement behind him. Turning, he saw the Dark Lord lifting one of the vials, swirling the potion to observe its color and texture. "An excellent brew, Severus," he complimented. "Thank you, my lord," he replied. The Dark Lord sighed at his cold formality. "Come, I have something to show you." The two moved silently through the ancient halls. The Dark Lord hissed softly, resting one spidery hand on the wall. A door appeared, and they stepped into Harry's darkened room. A few candles flared to life, providing enough illumination for the watchers, but not enough to wake the sleeping child. In contrast to the typical adolescent sprawl, the boy was curled in a corner of the bed, clutching a pillow to him. Seeing an unnatural shadow in his peripheral vision, Severus drew his wand, only to have his wrist seized in an inhumanly strong grip. "Watch," Voldemort breathed, his voice filled with wonder. The shadow grew darker and somehow heavier. It wound itself up the bedpost and onto the bed. The vague form slowly coalesced, revealing a monstrous black snake, at least a dozen feet long, with burning sparks in its eye sockets. It draped itself over the sleeping boy, its blunt muzzle actually touching Harry's lips as it inhaled each breath the boy exhaled. Severus jumped as a fleshy and blood serpent crawled over his foot on its way to join the great shadow snake on the bed. It was only the forerunner. A dozen adders and garden snakes crawled after it. Eerily glowing snakes, magical and mundane, emerged from the walls and floor. Soon, a great Gordian knot of scaled bodies covered the bed and its occupant. "Breathtaking, isn't it?" the Dark Lord murmured. "Are Thusia ghosts?" Severus asked, looking at the translucent forms. One hissed at him and shook its rattle in warning. "Yes, even the spirits of our totem adore him. Oh, he will make a grand Lord Slytherin." The Dark Lord released a breathless, almost giddy laugh. The pair watched for the better part of an hour as ghosts, spirits, and living creatures came to touch the new heir. Severus whispered, "Does Harry?" "He has no idea. They will be gone when he awakens." The Dark Lord sighed pensively. "They are loath to let him go. I will be hard-pressed to send him back to Hogwarts. Your Lord Slytherin, now. Surely they will obey you." The Dark Lord shot him an amused look. "The way that Slytherin house always obeys you?" Severus grimaced, recalling Draco's Dementor prank during the brat's third year. "They want what they want and whom they want. They care nothing for education or societal expectations. They have been without a lord or an heir for a long time, and Harry is so young they want him close, so they can keep him safe. He will be upset if he is not allowed to return," Severus noted, keeping his tone neutral. "I know. I have entered into negotiations with our patron in this matter." Severus thought he was probably better off not knowing what that meant. Chapter 14, Birthday boy Lucius Malfoy sat, watching his lord attentively while Voldemort pondered whatever was bothering him. Though his appearance was several steps beyond eerie, Voldemort had somehow regained the focus and brilliance that had drawn the elite of magical Europe to him decades ago. He had inspired them, until his focus had become obsession, his brilliance instability. The intelligent among his followers had been relieved at his relatively easy end, and had quietly slipped back into the mainstream of magical life. Still, they had mourned their inspiring visionary who had promised them a magical renaissance. "Harry will be 15 in a few weeks," Voldemort finally said, his tone vaguely uneasy. Lucius understood instantly. Voldemort had pushed the boundaries of magic, faced harrowing ordeals, and led men into battle, but he had never been a parent. And, suddenly, he was responsible for raising not an infant or, relatively, tractable youngster, but a powerful teenaged wizard with every reason to defy him. And now he had to plan a birthday party for said teenager. Draco was difficult enough, and Lucius had the benefit of 15 years to get used to the boy. Also, while Voldemort may have magical and legal rights to the boy, he certainly did not have his loyalty. And Potter's conversion would no doubt be difficult. "A celebration is in order then, my lord. His birthdays needn't be large, formal affairs for a few years yet. Your son had quite a gala for his birthday, as I recall." The Dark Lord's voice was deceptively light, but Lucius was well aware of the venomous undercurrent. He nodded agreeably. "Yes, my lord. Draco has been attending formal functions for several years, long enough to be comfortable in such surroundings. Mr. Potter is unfortunately lacking that experience." He paused, considering. "While we hosted a large event on the day of Draco's birthday, he also had a small celebration with a few of his friends. They attended a Weird Sisters concert, then spent the rest of the evening at our home." Voldemort nodded thoughtfully, then said, "I am not ready to announce our connection to the world at large. Perhaps after his graduation from Hogwarts." The Dark Lord found himself absurdly grateful for the boy's continued animosity. Chaperoning a teenager's birthday party would do nothing for his reputation. Harry dressed in the clothes that Sesfi had laid out for him. These were a bit closer to Harry's normal Hogwarts clothes. Trousers, but with a button fly instead of a zipper, a button-up white shirt, and a light-weight open robe. Instead of a knitted vest, he was given a dark brown waistcoat with silver buttons. Harry had never been quite so excited about his birthday. The irony, which would have once choked his noble Gryffindor sensibilities, brought a wry, rather Slytherin smirk to his lips. Professor Snape had explained that Voldemort had planned a special outing for him and his friends. Of course, the usual conditions of dress and behavior had been imposed, but Harry didn't really mind. Unlike the Dursleys, and Dumbledore, a treacherous little voice murmured, the Dark Lord's rules and expectations were clear. The thought that his first friends wouldn't be present for his first birthday party saddened him. He'd imagined Sirius planning something like this for him, but beggars can't be choosers. Carpe diem, he reminded himself. Sesfi dithered over him, fussing with his hair and straightening his clothes. She, Harry guessed it was a female, anyway. The name Sesfi seemed sort of girly, was an inch from hysterics at the idea of her little master leaving her watchful eye. "A section, little master is being careful. A section," she hissed, tearfully. "A section, little master is listening to his watchers and is coming home safe and sound." A section. Harry nodded obediently. He wondered what the clingy little elf was going to do when he was at Hogwarts. Severus hadn't attended a child's birthday party since his own had ended when he left for Hogwarts. He had vague memories of presents, shrieking laughter, and children hyper from too many sweets. Of course, Harry was turning 15, not 5. Teenagers were not prone to sugar-fueled tantrums. They were prone to sneaking off to Snog, and going joyriding on borrowed horses or muggle-autos, and consuming mind-altering substances. And a broken bar. He swallowed his third dose of stomach-calming potion, and braced himself. The Geraldine Roquefort Sanctuary for Magical and Mundane Animals was a dump. Literally, Harry could see a heap of old tires and a tower of rusting autos over the worn wooden fence. A rusty metal sign read Hatfield Waste Disposal. Snape stepped forward and tapped the broken call box with his wand. A small tray shot out, and the professor dropped a handful of shiny galleons into it. The gate swung open, and they proceeded inside. Harry looked around eagerly, confident that the glamour the Dark Lord himself had applied would hold. A middle-aged witch helped 4 young children out of a rusted oven. A witch and wizard, holding hands and make calf's eyes at each other, stepped from an old refrigerator. Harry caught a tempting glimpse of rolling grasslands before the door closed behind the pair. Snape led the way, followed by the 5 students. A Death Eater Harry didn't know brought up the rear. The man was rather small and mediocre looking, but his magic felt coiled and sharp. Harry suspected the man was even more dangerous than Snape, and that was saying something. Snape opened the door of a rusted-out car and crawled in, looking a bit miffed by the undignified position. Harry eagerly clambered after. The door on the opposite side opened onto a meadow. Grass was growing, but the air had a chilly bite. Glancing back, Harry saw the incongruity of a car door hanging in midair. The rest of the group crawled out. Snape read from the leaflet for their benefit. "We're currently inside of a warded circle. This prevents the animals from sensing us, and protects us from them and vice versa. These circles are set in locations close to water or food, so that we will have a better opportunity to see the creatures." The students crowded to the very edge of the warded circle. "Look!" Harry exclaimed. 4 woolly mammoths crested a hill with ponderous grace, moving towards the creek that ran a few feet from the circle. True to the brochure's claims, the giant creatures were completely oblivious to their audience. The rest of the herd joined these scouts, who warily surveyed the surrounding area as the others drank. 6 hours later, Severus gladly escorted the wary teenagers to Diagon Alley for dinner at the Gilded Swan, a posh eatery. Though the 4 wizard-raised children had been ready to leave hours ago, none had dared to indicate their boredom to Harry, who had gazed at each creature with rapt fascination. He had been quite disappointed over those who had not made an appearance. Carmichael had assured him that the zoo was open at night, as well, and they could return to view the nocturnal creatures then. Even young Draco had controlled his usual brattiness, holding his peace while Harry spent most of an hour watching the frolicking narwhals. All in all, the day had gone quite well. A day at the zoo had seemed rather tame compared to the parties held for most wealthy pure-blood teenagers, but Harry had enjoyed it immensely. Severus pushed away the thought that the Dark Lord knew Harry a bit too well. He would enjoy the first birthday he spent with his son. It was nearly midnight when Harry finally made it to bed. After the incredible day at the zoo and the scrumptious dinner, they had spent the rest of the night playing games and opening presents. Harry had felt a bit uncomfortable about the gifts, but Draco pointed out that the adults liked sucking up to the Dark Lord and Harry should be glad to reap the benefits. Oddly enough, that made Harry feel better. He had gotten a gobstone set made of gold and precious gems from the Bulstrods, a luxury owl perch from the Goyles, a strange variant of wizard's chess that involved a 3-layer board from the Carmichaels, a self-adjusting saddle from the Crabs, apparently horseback riding was in his future, and an antique mirror that gave impeccable fashion and grooming advice from the Malfoys. The last to leave that evening, Draco had also given him a dozen rare chocolate frog cards. "You're pretty far behind, Potter. I've had a whole extra decade to collect them, so I thought I'd give you a hand up," the blonde had said, with a friendly smirk. Harry flopped on his bed and began tucking the hexagonal cards into the album containing his small collection. The handful of enchanted cardstock was by far his favorite gift. Though Hedwig would enjoy the perch, if he ever got back to Hogwarts. After a bath, Harry was finally wound down enough to go to sleep. He flopped onto his bed and onto something that made a peculiar crunching sound. Rolling on his side, Harry examined the pillow. It was plush, wine-red velvet with a tiny golden lion embroidered in each corner. Harry held it to his face and inhaled the scent. Lavender, chamomile, and a host of other herbs. The aroma was comforting and oddly familiar. Snuggling the pillow to him, he drifted off to sleep. Snape peeked in on Harry, grateful that Voldemort had finally given him a password in a human tongue. The sight of the boy wrapped around his gift filled Snape with a quiet sense of peace. He'd sewn it himself, whispering spells of peaceful sleep and healing into each stitch of something else he'd learned from his mother. He'd made a similar pillow more than a decade ago, shaped like a heart, and managed to slip the gift past Potter's watchful eyes. The few times he'd seen mother and child in Diagon Alley after the birth, the pillow was always tucked into the pram beside the infant.